My name is Ran, and I'm a mobile team lead at Wix. Today we're going to talk about tests, and when I say tests, we're going to talk about unit tests. So I'm a React Native developer in the last 3 years, and originally I was an iOS developer. I have an iOS background. I'm in Wix 2015, and I was participate in one of the most star open source in Wix, which is React Native Navigation, which is in my opinion, and I'm very opinionated here, is the best solution navigation in React Native. And also, I wrote React Native Camera Kit. We had a few hundreds of stars in GitHub also. Meet my dog. This is Bono, and he's a nice Labrador. And he's got an Instagram page. It's Bono Labrador, this one. You're welcome to follow. So you probably ask yourself what Wix has with mobile. Wix is a website framework. It's a web builder, and we have a mobile application. We call it internally OneApp, which is React Native since day one. We are not like Facebook. We are not a brownfield application. We never had a native application that we add React Native in it. We are React Native since day one. We did actually React Native in it. We have millions of downloads, hundreds of thousands of installation monthly, and thousands of installation daily, and hundreds of thousands active users, and it's going to be grow. We are 70 developers in 4 different sites. Of course, Vilnius, Tel Aviv, and 2 sites in Ukraine, Kiev and Dnipro. In Wix in general, we really believe in open source. So if we can do it like open source first, so we do it. In OneApp, we wrote already React Native open source, about like 60 open sources. So let's dive into my talk. So in my talk, I will answer 3 major questions. The first one is why to test? Why bother writing tests? We're adding code. We're adding code to maintain. Why do we need it? After I try to convince you this, we're going to answer what to test, what project part we have, and what to test in each project part. How to test, how we need to test each part of the project part. And when I say how to test, we're not going to focus about the tools that we have. We're going to focus about the code that we're writing. So let's start. Why to test? When I'm writing code, for me, working code is not enough. I want to write a code that I be able to maintain. If me, or in the future, or one of my colleagues, I want him to be able to maintain it for the long run. I don't like the feeling of fear to change the code. I don't know what will break. I don't have a safety net for the new code that I'm writing. So the fear of change is making me to freeze. It's like I'm not free enough. I don't want to generate legacy codes since the day one the code been written. We're going to talk later on about legacy code. And I want to be free, as I mentioned. So I want to be free to refactor. I want to be safe to refactor. I want to have the test as safety net. What's really important for me in tests, really useful for me in tests, that I have an immediate feedback. If something breaks, I'm getting a red light. If the code that I wrote is OK, so I got a green light. From all this list, it's very, I thought a lot about this list. But what's really important for me when I'm writing tests is the test is actually improve my code design. When it's hard for me to test the code, it means to me that I need to change the code design. I hope that I convince you with why to test and why it's really important to write some tests, some unit tests. Let's jump into the, to the next question. What to test? First, let's name the project part. So we have the views, which include screens, components, maybe a custom component that we wrote, maybe a component that we got from any NPM library. And we have the business logic. When you say business logic, you say basically actions and stores. And you might say present and services. We're not going to touch them. When we write a React Native application, a React application, it kind of forces us to use a unidirectional data flow. Let's explain a little bit what is unidirectional data flow. So the user touched the screen. So the view got the touch, handled the touch. It called one of the action. The action used some services, maybe going to a remote server and fetch some data. Update the stores that some of the data had been changed. And the store is bound with the view. I'm here in this line. The store is bound with the view by Redux or Mobix. Internally, and we have an open source in Wix called Remix. It's as Redux and as Mobix. It also binds the store and the view is something changed in the store. So it's going to be appeared immediately in the view. We're going to explain a little bit about Redux later on. Let's explain each part and what to test in each part. So we have the action. What are actions? So the action is the actual worker. The code inside action is the actual code that doing the business logic. It might update the store, fetch some network requests, interact with some services. When I say services, I mean, for example, database services that get and set some data from the database. It's very encapsulated object that's doing a specific job. That's what the service. Because all the stuff that I mentioned now, the action is the actual worker. We would like to have 100% coverage with this. We want to test each line of code in action. What to test in action? When I come to test when I come to write some tests in the actions, so I keep in mind that I test only side effects. Let's first define what side effects are. Modify some state outside its local environment. So we're going to see in a moment an example that if I filter some data, so I don't want to test it. It's something that is not a side effect. It's not like directly affect outside of the local environment. So I would like to test inside action. I would like to test get and set operation on the store. Of course, I would like to test some that fetch been called, and some services that been called, and broadcasting events or messages. Let's see some code. So here I get the action, which is get rockets. It's very straightforward and very classic action. So here we first set loading before all the operation, before I try to fetch from external service, from a remote server, to get the rockets. So I set loading to true. Of course, I would like to test it. It's side effect. It sets some data in the store. After this, I would like to see that I would like to test that fetch been called. Then here, I filter. Filter, as I mentioned before, is not a side effect. If you want to be really religious, so you can test that you're calling to lodes, that calling to filter. But I try to avoid this because it's a loop that I can find the end of it. And finally, I will test also the set data with the filter rockets. And of course, I will set loading to false, and also a setter, which I will like to test. Let's continue to store. What is store? Store holds the application state. It includes getters and setters, and it includes selectors. So when I say selectors, in my talk, I mean that it manipulates the data that's stored in the store. Let's take an example. For example, if I have Unix time, which is in time, which is Unix time, and I would like to show a time that the human can understand. So of course, I won't show any Unix time on the screen. So I will make any data manipulation of the raw data that I have in the state. I call this selector. Store, it's very sensitive data stored there. So I would like to have it test. I like to have 100% test in store. Let's see a very straightforward example here. When I come to test my store, so what worked for me, that I define a before state, doing some state manipulation, and then I test it afterward. So here we can see my state. I have the state which include the data array. Here, as I mentioned before, I use Remix, which is like wrap Mobix. I have the getters, and I have the setters. Whoop, sorry, it's cut. Yes. So this is my, my test for this store. So first, I define the before state, the initial state for this test. I set the data, and I see that the store been changed as I expected it to be. Views. Here's come my personal opinion about views. This is how I work in Wix. This is what worked for me. This is why I try to teach my team to work. I don't test views. But first, let's define what views are. Component for building UI, very straightforward. I keep my views in order not to test them without any business logic. I will show you an example later on. Views might call to actions, that the action will change the store. Leading to data change from the store, which Redux and Mobix and Remix give us this bind between the data stored in the store and the view, calling the render. And we might modify the data from the presenter or selector. And as you probably can guess, I don't test it. So what to test in views? As I mentioned, I don't test it, and I kind of invent a rule of thumb that I have no logical if. And I explain what is logical if. So the left one is a logical if. At the moment that I write this kind of if with this kind of condition, rockets.length bigger than 3, I assume few stuff here. I first know the view currently knows that the rockets is an array. That if it's going to be big, so I'm going to render something different. And if I would like to change the structure of my store to be, for example, from array to be an object or to be a JSON, it's going to be very hard because I need to change it in a few places, more than once. This is a non-logical if. It's something that inferred directly from the store. If I see is loading, if the prop is loading, sorry, it shouldn't be here a method, is a prop, it should be is loading. Thank you, Victoria. Where are you? Not here. So if the prop is loading, so I should render immediately the loading states. This kind of if is, I don't assume anything here. It's very inferred from the store. I get it in the props. And for me, this one is a logical if that I assume a lot of stuff. And here, I don't assume a thing. But what if I will think that I will want to test for example, the button pressed been called. So this is how it's look like. So I have the, for example, button that on press, and here I test that on rockets press been called. For me, it's useless because I don't test the framework. This kind of test is testing the framework, and I treat my framework as a black box. If the button on rockets press, for example, never been called, so anyway, I don't have nothing to do with it. I don't have nothing to do with it. It's the responsibility of React Native. So the rule of thumb is no logical if, because we are not testing the framework. Let's continue to the last question, how to test. And again, we're not going to focus about tools. We're going to talk about the actual code, what we are, how to test our code. So we have a testing approach. As I mentioned before, it's hard for us to test, so we probably design it wrong. It's no matter if we use TDD or we use 100% coverage. It's no matter. If it's hard for me to test it, if I need to mock the whole outside world in order to test my code, so I need to rethink about the code architecture, and I need to redesign it again. Let's see an example. So here, I have an initial state. User clicks the button. I move to the loading state, and then I see the data. It's going to be kind of a lot of code. Try to be with me. So the first state, it's initial state, no data. This is what's rendered, these rockets. And here you can see the title, we hire in rockets. OK. So initial state, no data. This is how the render look like, very straightforward. No logical if, this is not logical if. If is loading is true, I render loader. Here this is not the case, so I immediately render the list which have an empty state. The second state, user press the button, I loading the state and fetch the data. I'm moving to loading state and fetching the data. This is the only thing that's happening when the user pressed the button. So the action being called, bring rockets data. Bring rockets data. First, it's set loading to true. Then I'm going to bring the data from the rocket service that I have. We're going to see it like in the next slide. Then I filter the data because I wanted to show you only the rockets with an image URL. And then I set the filter data. And finally, I set the loading to false. This is how the test should look like for the previous code. As you can see here, I test only side effects. So I mock all the stuff that I need here. I mock the return value from the rocket service, which is this one. Mock return values, return rockets, which I predefine here the rockets. I call the actual action. And here I test only side effects. So I test the set loading, which is set something in the state. As I mentioned before, a pure side effect. Here, here I test also side effect that get rockets data being called, also a side effect. It's like under the hood, it's doing the fetch. Here, I test that store being called with set data, also a setter. And here, another one, pretty redundant, but I check the set loading being called. This is how my service look like. And I decide to make also tests for this service. So very straightforward. I have a library which I wrote, also 100% coverage, which is HTTP, with a simple API called get. And it gets, the parameter for this function is an URL. And then it returns the rockets data .rockets. I try to keep my service to know the contract with the server in only one place, which is the server. The service is the only one that knows that the response from the server is an object that has a rockets array. So none beside of this service knows about these rockets, about this rockets array that inside the rockets data JSON. This is the test, how it looks like. So I mock the return value from the HTTP, and I test that the answer is as I expect it to be. Return value is also a side effect. I return something to the world, so I would like to test it. This is the test. The final state that I arrived, I would like to show the data. I would like to show the rocket list. In my map state props inside my view, I have two props, is loading and data. When I set loading to true, we're going to see in the screen loader, the spinner. When we set data, sorry, when is loading is false, we're going to see the data list. If nothing is in the data list, we're going to see the empty states in the data. Otherwise, we're going to see this one. We're going to see the data list. As I mentioned now, in words. So if something is loading, if loading state is true, so I render the loader. And here, I render this. I render the flat list. We finished with these three questions. And during my work at Wix, I had a pretty continuous challenge to deal with legacy code. So I decided to talk a little bit about dealing with legacy code, but because I think it's something that we very often, as a software developer, we handled. So first, let's define what is legacy code. Legacy code is code without tests. It's nothing related with his age of this code, if it's old or if it's new. Legacy code is code without tests. In the next click, I'm gonna read a quote that I really believe and I really connect to it. So I show you. Code without tests is bad code. It doesn't matter how well written it is. It doesn't matter how pretty or object-oriented or well encapsulated it is. With tests, we can change the behavior of our code quickly and verifiable. Without them, we really don't know if our code is getting better or worse. So the first line, code without tests is bad code. I really believe it's really worked for me. I try to keep my, my code in 100% coverage, which is, I gain a lot from this. I got a lot of bugs being solved even before it goes to production. OK, dealing with, with legacy code. So first, let's talk very briefly about the test pyramid. So we have E2E tests, which is with facing the production server's URL. We have the mocked E2E tests. Some of you know this as integration tests. And we have the unit tests. So first, how I deal with legacy code. I start with what I have. I have in my hands a working code. Code that actually doing the work. So first, I get confident with E2E tests. I try to wrap this working code with much E2E tests as I can. In order to get confidence, to change some stuff, not to be feared to change stuff. Then I refactor. And each time I refactor, I add unit tests for the refactor or for the new code. And if I need to do it more and more, I jump to number one and do it as few times as I want. In this way, I'm getting for free E2E tests, which cover the main flows, and also not that for free, but I'm getting what I wanted from the beginning. I'm getting a code which covers with unit tests. So let's wrap up what we talked until now. So we answered 3 questions. Why to test? I try to convince you why to test. I hope I succeed. What to test and how to test. Finally, you got some extra with dealing with legacy code. And that's all. That was me. Thank you so much.